Well, let me introduce tonight's guest. Her name is Marla Dukharan. Why do I keep messing up this name? And I know how to say it. Marla Dukharan is a Caribbean economist and advisor, and she's based in Trinidad and Tobago, as far as I know, but she can tell me if I'm wrong. And we're going to be discussing the foreign exchange crisis in Trinidad and Tobago. You may have been hearing about it. We discussed it on the program last week. A lot has been happening. Several banks have dramatically reduced the amount of US dollars you can access even from your own accounts. I've been seeing TikTok videos, Instagram videos, all the influencers are on the issue, on the case, saying in Trinidad, you can't get US because there is basically a foreign exchange crisis. What is going on? And is there a lesson here for other Caribbean countries? Let's welcome Marla Dukharan to the show. Hi, Marla. Welcome to Taking Stock.
Hi, good evening, Kalilah. Are you hearing me?
Yes, hearing you very well.
Okay, great. And of course, you should know how to pronounce my last name. I was born on Dukharan Avenue in Kingston.
Okay. And I
I'm
know it
joking.
in
I'm
my
joking.
head.
I'm born in Trinidad. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Are you there now? Because the last video I saw
Yeah.
of you, you were somewhere traveling.
Yeah, no, I'm back. Yes.
Okay, good. So for those who aren't familiar with you and your work, just give us a little background.
Well, I'm an economist. I'm from Trinidad. I lived in Barbados for a few years. I do some advisory work and work with governments in the Caribbean as well as the private sector. I'm on a couple boards, private sector boards in the Caribbean, as well as I'm on the board of Capri in Jamaica, the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. Very proud of what they've accomplished. And very proud of what Jamaica has accomplished. I've been talking, at every opportunity about how Jamaica has made so much progress in the last 10 to 12 years. And I talk about the epoch a lot. I saw you mention something about the Prime Minister saying that there might be some changes to the epoch. So yes, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, but I cover the Caribbean and I work with public sector and private sector across the Caribbean.
Okay, so break it down for us. What is happening in Trinidad and Tobago? Is the foreign exchange crisis as bad as it's been made to seem? And what's causing it? But first of all, before we get to the causes, what is the situation right now?
Well, the situation right now is that so the foreign exchange reserves, which is, I'm sure you keep track of what Jamaica's foreign exchange reserves are in the Bank of Jamaica, meaning, and that's what we use to calculate import cover. The foreign exchange reserves position in Trinidad and Tobago is just about 5 billion US dollars, which sounds good. It sounds healthy. The central bank says it's, about 6 months or so of import cover,
Yeah, that's
which
about that's
if
about what it is in Jamaica right now too.
which
About
sounds
5 billion.
great, right? Six months of import cover sounds great. And actually, yes, it's about the same as Jamaica, and you have twice the population that we have here in Trinidad. But if it wasn't for the fact that the government has borrowed so much US dollars, and if we take away what they've drawn down from our sovereign wealth fund, our reserves would actually be zero right now. So it's only because the government has been borrowing US dollars and that they've been drawing down on what is our piggy bank, basically our sovereign wealth fund that is supposed to be there to help the country develop into the future, for the future generations to have intergenerational equity with those generations that exist today. If it wasn't for these sources of US dollars, we would have zero reserves. So that's one thing to consider. We still have 5 billion, and the sovereign wealth fund, which is called the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, has also just over 5 billion as well. So
So
you
the
might
five
think, well,
billion, the
okay,
5 billion, so the 5 billion that are in the reserves, you're saying those are borrowed funds?
yeah, it's either borrowed or drawn down from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, which means organically our country is not earning foreign exchange right now to the point where it's building up reserves. No, the reserves from whatever we've earned from exports have been depleted. And so what we have in reserve right now is all either borrowed or withdrawn from our sovereign wealth fund. And our
Wow.
sovereign wealth, called the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, earns US dollars, or is the US dollars are deposited into that fund when we earn more US dollars from oil and gas exports than the government budgets. So, for example, if the government budgets to earn $5 from oil and gas for one fiscal year, and we earn $7, a proportion of the $2 extra goes into the Heritage and Stabilization Fund to be saved for longer term development needs, so that we have what is called intergenerational equity, meaning that the future generations of Trinidadians and Tobagonians will be as well off as we are today. And that's what, the whole idea behind a Heritage and Stabilization Fund, sovereign wealth fund, is, except that we have been drawing down on it for no good reason, really. And during COVID, the government amended the legislation to allow for withdrawals for all kinds of reasons that was not intended initially when the Heritage and Stabilization Fund was initially constructed. So you might think that, okay, we have 5 billion in reserve and we have 5 billion in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, that's 10 billion. You might think, well, that sounds like a lot, right? Mm-hmm. Well, we had twice this in terms of reserves years ago. And if you look at, so I publish a monthly Caribbean economic report. And actually, this is very important for your listeners to look at. When you go to this report, and what I do is I put a chart for the reserves for all the countries in the Caribbean that I cover. And all of them have, ups and downs and fluctuations in their levels of reserves. Jamaica has done pretty well, and so has Barbados. Our country, Trinidad and Tobago, is the only one where reserves is just down. It's just been declining steadily since roughly 2013 or so. And, the fact that it's declining is simply based on two things. One, we earn most of our US dollars from the oil and gas sector, because we are an exporter of energy, as you might recall, and roughly about 75% or 80% of the amount of foreign exchange that comes into Trinidad and Tobago is earned from the energy sector. Now, the energy sector has not been earning the kind of foreign currency that it used to, let's say back in the 70s, 80s, even back up to 2013. We're earning a lot less now for a couple of reasons. One is the international price of these commodities, but also because of our production being very weak for oil in particular, but also natural gas. Our projections for production are never achieved. We are always falling short of what we expect to produce. So
why is production so far down? Why is production so far down? Is it just inefficiencies, or are you guys running out of these commodities?
So that's a good question. In terms of the oil, we are running out of oil, and we have every so often a Ryder Scott analysis that shows that we're going to run out very soon. We do have more natural gas production than we do oil. But yes, we're running out. And increasingly, the oil and gas that is there is more expensive to extract based on how deep, if it's in deep water, etc. And then you also have competition, like Guyana, for example, is the world's newest producer of oil. And it's much cheaper, to get the oil from Guyana than it is to invest in the infrastructure to extract oil from Trinidad and Tobago. We are a mature producer. We have been producing oil for over 100 years. So it's running out. So this is one of the reasons why we're not producing as much as we used to. The other reason is that you have to incentivize, or the producers of oil and gas, which are mostly foreign in Trinidad and Tobago, foreign owned, it has to make financial sense to them. And the complaint that they make is that the government doesn't give them enough incentives to invest in the very expensive exploration work that has to be done to discover more oil and gas for them to produce. So it's a complex situation, but you're right. it's generally because we're mature, very mature, and there isn't a lot of oil and gas left, and the government is perhaps not doing as much as the private sector would like it to do to make it make sense financially for them to explore for more oil and gas.
But
So
what
our
about your
production is declining.
manufacturing?
Sorry.
Yeah, well, what about your
Sorry, go ahead.
manufacturing sector? Because Trinidad and Tobago exports have traditionally, I know Jamaican exporters and manufacturers have always complained that it's an unfair advantage that Trinidad has because you guys have the oil sector subsidized,
Yeah.
fuel prices for manufacturers. So you guys have traditionally been strong in manufacturing. So is it that those industries aren't earning US dollars the way they used to either?
Well, that's also a very good question. A lot of what goes into the manufacturing process, let's say food and beverage, right? That's a good example. Food and beverage manufacturing, we have quite a bit of in Trinidad and Tobago. And a lot of the components or the ingredients in the food and beverage manufacturing process, let's just say sugar, for example, is imported. We do not produce large scale sugar like we used to, and so these ingredients have to be imported, which means we need foreign currency to import it. Now, if there is limited access to foreign currency, then the manufacturers can't get the ingredients that they need. But what is more important than everything we've just discussed, Kalilah, is the fact that if you have a commodity, let's call US dollars a commodity right now in Trinidad and Tobago. If you have a commodity that's scarce, that the government has $5 billion in reserve and $5 billion in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, and every couple of weeks they make an injection of these US dollars into the banking system. Don't you think that if you control the price of this foreign currency and you have the price set to the same level you had it set since, I think, 2017, if my memory serves me correct, it's in a report I wrote, it's on my website recently. If you cap the price at $6.80 TT for $1, and this commodity has become more and more and more scarce, and you keep it at that price, and you control the supply by maintaining a certain level of injections into the banking system, what do you think happens? You are basically subsidizing this commodity that has become increasingly scarce because you're not earning as much. And instead of allowing, like Jamaica does, allowing some market determination in the exchange rate, allowing the exchange rate to move, Jamaica at one point used to be, just like the Cayman Islands, it used to be actually stronger than the US dollar. And now you have 150, I can't remember exactly what's your exchange rate.
Almost 160 now.
Right. That means that the Bank of Jamaica, in its inflation targeting regime, is allowing the market to tell the Bank of Jamaica what our demand and supply is, and therefore what the price of this commodity called US dollars should be. In Trinidad, in all their wisdom, the central bank there, they should be talking to the Bank of Jamaica to understand how to do this right. But the central bank in Trinidad and Tobago is saying, you know what, we're going to control the price and leave it at $6.80 roughly, TT for $1. We're going to control the supply, and guess what happens? You then have a black market. Now, so there is a foreign exchange crisis in that the official market for foreign exchange is very tight. But interestingly, and it was in the press this week, that the black market, you can get almost any amount of US dollars in the black market in Trinidad and Tobago, but you have to pay $7.50, $8, sometimes even more than $8 TT for $1. So what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago is that the authorities have manufactured a crisis. This is a crisis that didn't need to exist. And we used to have an auction mechanism up until 2014, where the banks would bid on the US dollars, and therefore, based on the price that they bid, the exchange rate used to move, just like Jamaica's does, right?
Mm-hmm.
Similar mechanism, not exactly the same, but a similar mechanism that allowed the market to give that feedback as to what is my demand for US dollars, and the price moved accordingly. They eliminated that in 2014. Why? Nobody knows. And So this crisis that we have now is simply a manufactured one where the authorities basically have fixed the price. They are subsidizing the sale of US dollars, where it could be sold for 750, it could be sold for 8, and they are controlling and reducing the access, the amount that they sell to the market. And that is what is causing this crisis. It's purely created by the government.
Because Trinidad's exchange rate is not fixed, theoretically, but they are behaving as though it is fixed.
Exactly. It's called a de facto managed peg, I think is the last terminology. But if they decide to fix it at 680, since I think it's 2017, then it's pegged. It's rough. I mean, the government has just basically decided they're going to peg it at 680 and leave it.
And that is causing severe implications. But here's the part that I'm still confused about, Marla. So if there is, regardless of whether the funds are borrowed, there is money in the reserves. So you have the 5 billion borrowed, you have the 5 billion from the wealth fund.
The Heritage and Stabilization Fund, yeah.
Right. Why is it that Trinis can't get US dollars from the banks if the money is there?
Because, okay, so our government, the way the FX mechanism works is that our government taxes the oil and gas companies in US dollars, mostly, right? Those US dollars are basically paid by, let's say, the BP, British Petroleum, it used to be called BP, BHP, whoever, the oil and gas producers are. It's paid to the government, which is the central bank, basically. And the central bank uses those US dollars and shares it. The word we use is injection, but it's shared up amongst the banks on a periodic basis. So every couple of weeks, the central bank will say, okay, I'm coming to the market with, let's say, 100 million. And the banks, based on their market share, get a share of this US dollars. What has been happening is that because they have, as I mentioned to you, they have fixed the exchange rate at 6.8. The black market rate is 750 or 8. It means that the government has created speculative demand for US dollars. They have created more demand than would ordinarily exist if the market operated the way Jamaica operates, for example, because everybody is looking at this official exchange rate at 6.8 and saying, wait a second, the official exchange rate is 6.8, the black market rate is 7.5 or 8. And so guess what? We can buy US dollars, hold on to it, sit on it, and then at some point there's going to be a devaluation and boom, we make money. So they've created a lot of speculative demand. So the people who really need the foreign exchange.
That used to happen here a lot up until 5 years ago.
So the people like me who have kids in university abroad can't get US dollars because there's so much demand that's soaking up the supply that is speculative demand. The other type of demand that the authorities have created is something called precautionary demand. So when I'm ready for my foreign exchange to pay 20,000 US dollars for these school fees, I don't get it. So what I do is I tell the bank months in advance, I would like to have some foreign exchange, and I buy over time, and I end up asking for more than I really need, simply because if I ask for 20, I'll get 10 over time. So maybe I need to ask for 50. And so this is what everybody does. Everybody is demanding more than they need because they are being cautious. So it's a precautionary demand that is created that would not or otherwise exist if you had easy access. In other words, when something is scarce, you go and you buy it up. Like, remember everybody buying toilet paper during COVID for whatever reason. Once something is scarce, human nature is that we buy up more than we really need to use. Because I'm sure we didn't need to use all of that toilet paper during COVID. But it's the same with foreign exchange. And so they have created more demand than would ordinarily exist if they did not create this artificial shortage. It is purely created by the government. And the real question we need to be asking, which is, I wrote about this and I talked about this a week or two ago, is why? Why are they doing this? That's the real question.
So we have a couple of really interesting observations from our viewers. So let me bring those questions in. Shells
Mhm.
says Jamaicans a ball said the US dollar too high, but your advice is for Trinis to follow Jamaica, not for Caribbean people to develop products and services that will pay US dollars for. So she's suggesting that the solution is for Trinidad to have services that earn US dollars or to export more, and that would solve the problem.
Indeed, I agree that we need to be doing more to earn more foreign currency so that we can pay for the imports we need, right? That's true for every country in the Caribbean. The majority of the Caribbean earns most of its foreign currency from the tourism sector. There's some countries like Jamaica that also earn foreign currency from the remittances, earn foreign currency from manufacturing exports, but tourism and energy are the two major sources of foreign exchange in the Caribbean. And yes, we need to be doing a lot more to earn more foreign exchange. But again, if you earn foreign exchange, would you bring it in to a country where, for example, and this is what happens in Trinidad. Somebody, you were talking about the influencers on Instagram. You can have an account, a bank account in Trinidad with 10,000 US dollars. You go to the bank and you ask them, can I get 500? Can I get 1,000? Can I get whatever? Because I'm traveling. If you get $200, you're lucky. You don't
Mm-hmm.
even get access to your own US dollars sitting
Your
in your
own
account.
money.
So even if you were earning US dollars, even if you were producing goods and services and earning US dollars, would you bring it to Trinidad? And when you're ready for it, you can't get it? I wouldn't.
I see Caron Rose has been writing a lot about that. I'm sure you've seen his videos. He's moved
Of
to
course.
Thailand, saying that the biggest reason he left Trinidad is because he can't access his US money and he
Yeah.
primarily earns in US. And so he's moved all the
Why?
way to Thailand.
I agree with him 100%. 100%.
So the next comment is from Nigel Phillip. Nigel says, I think the credit card use, a car virtually for every person, and a love for all things foreign also plays a big part. So is it that foreign taste is a big problem?
You know what? I really don't agree with that comment. And the reason I don't agree with that comment is that if the exchange rate was allowed to move the way Jamaica's moves, and we did not have a subsidized exchange rate, let's say the exchange rate was $8, 8 TT to 1. Do you think we would be buying so many cars? Do you think we would be importing so many, as you put, all things foreign? Actually, whenever, and this is true not just of foreign exchange, this is true of electricity, of everything. Whenever the government subsidizes something, it encourages the overconsumption of that thing. Okay. And so the government, I keep saying this, and I don't know how else to say this, but the government has created a problem that we otherwise would not have if they did not fix the rate and if they weren't controlling the supply the way that they are doing right now. If the exchange rate was allowed to move so that demand and supply would be more in equilibrium, and let's say if the US dollar exchange rate was $8 to 1, we would not have the level of consumption of foreign goods that we have now. So we can't blame Trinidadians and Tobagonians for behaving in a rational manner. We have to blame the policymakers that created the problem.
You keep mentioning the government. Is Trinidad's central bank independent from the government like it is here in
Absolutely not.
Jamaica?
Absolutely not. No, we didn't have that legislation you have. And the legislation we have says basically that the central bank reports to the Minister of Finance.
Mm. So
So that's a big part of the problem.
what has been the policy response? What has been the government's response to all of this?
To basically do what your viewer just did, basically blame the people of Trinidad and Tobago and say it's your fault. You're importing too many cars, you're consuming too much strawberries and champagne and whatever, you're flying here, there, and everywhere, you're basically overspending US dollars. That's basically their policy response. They haven't done anything about it. And you've had people like me and other commentators saying to them, we once had a system that worked up until 2014. Why can't we just put it back in place? And they haven't. So that's the real question. To whose benefit is this system? Well, guess what? If the government is subsidizing US dollars, maybe it's to somebody's benefit that they get easy access to cheap US dollars as opposed to paying $8 in the black market. That's what you really have to be asking.
Is the
Clearly,
exchange
somebody is
rate
benefiting from this.
is
Sorry.
is the exchange rate a political issue in Trinidad and Tobago? What that number is? Because here in Jamaica, and I also have experience being from Belize, where we have a fixed exchange rate, also like officially fixed 2 to 1 to the US dollar. And if that exchange rate was to change, it would be a massive political issue. People would not be happy with the government for that change because of the implications. And here in Jamaica as well, when the exchange rate falls, and we're looking at when it's going to cross the 160 mark, it's going to be a political issue, at least psychologically. Is it
Yes.
would that be the reason you think that the politicians are holding on to 680? Because psychologically, if it moves to 7 and 8 officially, that's going to be a political problem for them.
I think what is even more a political problem is the cost of living. And, this year globally, we've had the biggest year for elections ever in history. We had more people voting this year globally than we ever had in history. And the reason why so many incumbents lost, including the United States, where we recently saw Trump win, is simply because the incumbents always lose when the cost of living is high. And a devaluation or depreciation of the currency generally can cause inflation. So that, I think, is the cost of living is a bigger political issue than the actual number. Yes, there is a psychological threshold of each dollar, like so $7, $8, they're each psychological barriers. But again, I go back to the fact that we had an auction mechanism that allowed some market determination in the exchange rate, and up until 2014, and it didn't. You had a very slow and steady depreciation of the currency, just like Jamaica does. And nobody even really noticed, if you know what I mean. It was not a political issue then. So why should it be now if we go back to that system? I don't think it will be. I think the cost of living is more of a political issue than the actual number of the exchange rate.
Yeah, I feel like once it officially hits 758, the politicians are going to be blamed, or fear that they're going to be blamed as you're the ones that caused our economy to slide and our dollar to fall to 8.
To be honest, the way that I read the situation now in Trinidad, and the fact that you can't even get $200 if you want to travel, and you're trying to withdraw it from your own bank account. I think that Trinidadians and Tobagonians would be much happier to have access to the US dollars that they need, even if it's at $7, even if it's at $8, than to not have the access. Because as I mentioned, and it was in the press earlier this week, there was an investigation done by some journalists. You can get any amount of US dollars basically at the black market rate, in the black market. So it means that psychological barrier has already been broken or been met. So I really don't think that's a valid reason to keep the exchange rate at a subsidized rate of 680.
And it will take a lot of consumer education and education for the public in general, because there is that psychological issue and there are the political repercussions. Even if you, as an economist, Marla, it's easy for you to understand. Like, you can see the clear as day what the connection is, what the implications are, and what the solution is. But for people on the ground, that psychological issue, our dollar is sliding and it's your fault. And so it's going to take a lot of public education to overcome that. I remember us having this exact conversation in Jamaica probably about 7 years ago, when the BOJ was implementing B-Fix-It and all these things, implementing inflation targeting and all of these things. And that same point was made. Would you rather get the dollar at 150, but you're able to get dollars, or get the dollar at 120 and you can't get dollars? That's the issue.
Well, the thing is, I hear you. And yes, it is a psychological barrier. But the thing is, like I said, the average person, the man on the street, is paying black market rate already and is getting access to US dollars at the black market rate. All of these stores buy and sell US dollars, even though it's illegal to do so. Most storefronts have a sign saying, we accept US dollars at 7 or 7.50 or whatever the case is. So the average person already is using US dollars to make payments, or they're buying US dollars to conduct their business, to travel and to do whatever. So I mean, I hear you, and I think that yes, there is an education element, but I think the average person is already paying 7.58.
So we have a few comments, and even if they don't know that they are, because it's passed through, if you're buying goods imported at 7.58, then you're
It's
paying
already
that
there.
cost. You're paying that
Exactly.
cost in inflation. A few comments here. I'm assuming these commenters are from Trinidad. Russell says, our demand for imports is inelastic. A float will only send the price of goods to the heavens. And he adds, there are those who can afford it at a higher rate, while those who need the foreign exchange for things like education and healthcare might not be able. And then
Okay.
similarly, let
Sorry.
me add this other one because it's the same
Mhm.
vein. Modus operandi says, we import everything, so cost of living will go up exponentially in Trinidad.
Just to your comment, the fact that there are people who are buying foreign currency on the black market at 7.58 at whatever rate, it means that the cost of living has already priced in a devaluation to 7.50 or 8 or whatever it is that they're paying at the black market. So that what the comment that was made is valid, that when there is a devaluation, there is a knock-on effect to the cost of living. And I'm saying that's true. However, our inflation, and by the way, Trinidad and Tobago has some of the lowest inflation in the region in the past year or two.
I was just
And
wondering about that.
it's low. It's very low. And
How?
so this,
How is inflation
how?
low when you are basically experiencing an unofficial devaluation?
Well, one, because it's already priced in, because people have been buying on the black market for a long time. And so that 7.58 is already priced in. And the reason also why inflation is so low is because the economy is so bad. It is a very, very weak economy. It is not doing well at all. And that's a classic sign of a very weak economy, that the inflation is low. Growth is very, very slow. Economic activity is very, very weak. And so it's just that's not showing up in the inflation rate.
Wow, very interesting. So is there any indication that any change will be made, that anything will be done?
Well, there is no indication that there will be a change. There's a lot of people like myself and others commenting and encouraging the government to go back to the auction mechanism, or some mechanism that allows market determination in the exchange rate, so that we can alleviate the problem that we have, and so that they encouraging them to just stop subsidizing US dollars. And who are they subsidizing it for? Who's got access? All of that is very political, right? Um, we have an election due next year, somewhere around, I think it's due maybe by September. Actually, next year is the biggest year for election in the Caribbean. This year was the biggest year for elections globally. Next year is the biggest year for elections, because you guys have an election, right? We have
Yeah,
an
we have one
election.
due as well. Yes.
Exactly. So my only hope is that with an election will come a change in leadership. I don't know if there will be. Um, to be very honest with you, I'm not happy with the two main parties. I couldn't vote for either of them, to be very honest with you. And I say that unapologetically. I don't see, as a matter of fact, the opposition right now, if they were to return to power, they were the ones who dismantled the auction mechanism. They were the ones who started this problem. And this government has just continued in the same vein, because clearly it works for somebody in their favor to subsidize US dollars and give certain people access to it. That's what's really happening here. That's
So
what's really happening.
the opposition shares the same position as the government on this issue.
They're the ones who dismantled the auction mechanism.
So they
They're the
haven't
ones who.
given an indication that if we come to power, we'll re-implement it.
No, they haven't. And ironically, they dismantled it. And when this government took power in 2015, the first thing the finance minister did was say that he's going to introduce the auction mechanism because he recognizes that there's a problem without it. He said he was going to introduce it. He said it more than once. It was in his budget speech, and he never did.
Well, where does that leave you? Where does that leave the average Trinidadian, and especially businesses who rely on US dollars for their imports?
Well, Trinidadians and Tobagoans have found all kinds of creative mechanisms to get around this problem, as Jamaicans had done. Back in the day, I hear all kinds of stories from my friends in Jamaica about people traveling with US dollars in their shoes and things like this. Trinidadians and Tobagoans will find all kinds of creative ways to solve the problems that they have. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the businesses, the non-energy sector in Trinidad, and we've already seen it, the non-energy sector in Trinidad will start to suffer. It's suffering already. It's not doing very well. And there will be all kinds of consolidation and Jamaican businesses coming and buying up Trini businesses. That's what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen. That's what always happens when countries decline like this.
Wow. Very interesting. Because in Jamaica, we've always looked at Trinidad as like this powerhouse in the Caribbean, the economically the strongest in the English-speaking Caribbean. And if things continue the way they are, that may not be the case very soon.
This country is just, as we say, it's gone through. It's in the worst position I've seen ever. I mean, people say all the time, oh, but we had foreign exchange tightness in the past. Yes, we had a balance of payments crisis in the late 1980s, and there were all kinds of measures implemented that then led to the people rising up and, for example, staging a coup in 1990, which I'm sure you all would remember. So we've had problems in the past. This is a different problem. That was based on a shock and oil prices dropping to $8 a barrel or something like that. What we have now is the state creating a problem that can be easily avoided by reintroducing the auction mechanism that we had up until 2014. It's as simple as that. And letting the exchange rate move, just like Jamaica does, just like Dominican Republic does, just like we did at one point in time. But they've decided to subsidize the exchange rate and give certain people access to US dollars. That's what's happening in Trinidad. So they're basically running. You're running this country like if it's your own parlor. That's what's happening.
Thanks for that very comprehensive overview, Marla. I appreciate it.
Kalilah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I hope your listeners and your viewers learned something, and I hope I've made things easier to understand. I've written a lot about this. It's all on my website, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about this. Thank you very much.
That's marladukharan.com?
Yes, correct.
Okay, good. All right, so guys, check out the website, marladukharan.com, and you can see the spelling of her name in the description. Marla Dukharan, Caribbean economist and advisor.